Now you've learned about arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins, and how they're arranged into circulatory routes, right? So blood leaves the heart through arteries and flows into smaller arterioles and then into capillaries. Remember, at the capillaries we have the exchange, whether it's exchange of nutrients or gases or hormones. Whatever's going to leave the blood or leave the tissues to get back into the blood does so at the capillary beds. So you're going to learn in your lab studies the names and the locations of many of the vessels. But here at this point, I wanted to talk to you about some of the basic routes that blood takes as it transports things throughout the body. So each organ receives its own supply of freshly oxygenated blood. After birth, there are two basic routes for blood flow, and those are the systemic circulation and the pulmonary circulation. So the systemic circulation includes all of the arteries and arterioles that take oxygenated blood out from the left ventricle out to systemic capillaries. Systemic, remember, means of the body, right? So everywhere in the body except the lungs. So the systemic the systemic arteries and veins, the systemic arteries and arterioles take that oxygenated blood from the left ventricle out to the capillaries in the systemic areas of the body. And then the veins and the venules return that deoxygenated blood back through the right atrium after it picks up that CO2 out in body tissues and organs, right? So blood leaving the aorta and flowing through the systemic arteries is a bright red blood because it's very highly oxygenized. But as it moves through those capillaries, it loses some of the oxygen and picks up CO2. So systemic blood in veins becomes very dark. Some of the subdivisions of the systemic circulation include the coronary or cardiac circulation, which supplies the myocardium of the heart, cerebral circulation, which supplies the brain, the hepatic portal circulation, which extends from the gastrointestinal tract to the liver. When blood returns to the heart from the systemic route, it's pumped out of the right ventricle through the pulmonary circulation to the lungs. In the capillaries of the air sacs, which we call alveoli of the lungs, the blood loses most of its CO2 and takes in oxygen. So now the blood is bright red again. It returns to the left atrium of the heart. The left atrium sends that blood through the left ventricle, and then the left ventricle pumps that blood out to the systemic circulation. So far we've got systemic circulation of the body, coronary circulation of the heart, cerebral circulation that supplies the brain, supplies the brain, the hepatic portal circulation, which takes blood from the gastrointestinal tract to the liver, and then the pulmonary circulation, which takes that deoxygenated blood from the right side of the heart out to the lungs, where it becomes oxygenated again, and then that oxygenated blood goes back to the left side of the heart so it can be pumped out to the body. There's another major route of circulation, and that's called fetal circulation. Fetal implies of the fetus, right? So it only exists in the fetus, and it contains some special structures that allow the developing fetus to exchange materials with the mother through the placenta. So we'll examine each one of these very briefly. The hepatic portal circulation carries venous blood from the gastrointestinal organs and the spleen to the liver. A vein that carries blood from more than one capillary network is referred to as a portal vein. So you'll see a couple of these as you start learning veins. The hepatic portal vein receives blood from capillaries of the gastrointestinal organs and the spleen and delivers it to the liver. After you eat, the hepatic portal blood is rich in nutrients that were absorbed from the gastrointestinal tract. The liver stores some of them and modifies others before they pass into the general circulation. For example, when the liver receives a lot of blood sugar, glucose, it's going to convert that glucose into glycogen, which is a storage molecule. So it reduces blood sugar level shortly after the meal. I often refer to, when I'm talking about this, I talk about the glucose being individual little sugar molecules, and the glycogen is a big long chain molecule made of individual glucose. So if you think of each glucose as a Lego, and you take all those Legos and build a castle, then you've built glycogen, the castle, out of glucose, the Legos. So if you're going to store all that glucose, it's much more efficient to store it in a big molecule that you can access quickly and break it back down when you need more glucose. The liver also is responsible for detoxifying harmful substances like alcohol that have been absorbed across the gastrointestinal tract, and also helps to destroy bacteria that may be in the blood by phagocytosis. So blood leaves the liver through the hepatic veins, not the hepatic portal veins. Remember, the portal is where the blood comes together from 2 or more sources, but all that portal vein blood comes into the liver, and then it exits through hepatic veins back into the vena cava. So let's look at what we have here. We have small veins that are going to come from the stomach, the pancreas, and parts of the small intestine. They're going to merge together with the vein from the spleen, and that's going to come into another vein and form the hepatic portal vein. So this second vein is going to have small veins from the small intestine, part of the large intestine, the stomach, and the pancreas. Those are going to merge into a large mesenteric vein, the superior mesenteric vein. So your superior mesenteric and your splenic vein merge to form the hepatic portal vein. That's taking all of that nutrient-rich, but also sort of waste-rich, probably too, right? Because not everything that's in our food is good for us. So all of that stuff is all that blood is coming from your intestinal organs, your gastrointestinal organs, into the hepatic portal vein and into the liver for detoxification, cleaning up, and storage and modification of some of those nutrients. Then the cleaned up blood, you can think of it, goes out through the hepatic portal veins into the inferior vena cava, which then empties that blood back into the heart. The pulmonary circulation carries deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle to the air sacs, or the alveoli, in the lungs, and returns oxygenated blood from those air sacs out to the left atrium. So remember, the lungs are the only place we breathe oxygen in, right? So that's where we've got to send that blood to pick up oxygen. The pulmonary trunk emerges from the right ventricle, okay? So here you can see the pulmonary trunk. There's the right ventricle. There's the pulmonary trunk. It's going to branch into left and right pulmonary arteries, then go into smaller and smaller pulmonary arterioles, and then pulmonary capillaries out in the lungs. Now, I want to go back to that pulmonary artery for a moment. After we are born, the pulmonary arteries are the only arteries that carry deoxygenated blood. Remember, artery means to take blood away. So your pulmonary arteries, remember, pulmonary trunk branches into right and left. Your pulmonary arteries get that deoxygenated blood that just returned from the body and take that blood out to the lungs. All your other arteries in the body are going to be carrying oxygenated blood. Once those pulmonary arteries enter the lungs, they branch and divide into smaller pulmonary arterioles, and then finally into capillaries around those alveoli, the little air sacs in the lungs. CO2 leaves the blood and gets into the air sacs, and then we exhale to get rid of it. When we inhale, we bring in oxygen from the atmosphere, the atmospheric gases, and that oxygen fills the little alveolar sacs in the lungs, and when the blood is out there in those capillary beds, CO2 gets dropped off, oxygen gets picked up. So the pulmonary capillaries then, carrying that oxygenated blood, are going to unite to form small little veins called venules, and then eventually into larger pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins are going to bring oxygenated blood back into the left atrium. Then that left atrium sends that oxygenated blood down to the left ventricle. The left ventricle contracts, and blood goes out into the aorta and out to the body. So after birth, just like the pulmonary arteries were the only arteries carrying deoxygenated blood, after birth, the pulmonary veins are the only veins that carry oxygenated blood. Remember, usually veins are bringing blood back into the heart from the systemic circulation and carrying that deoxygenated blood returning from the body. So once the left ventricle contracts, that oxygenated blood is pushed out into the aorta and out into systemic circulation. So let's take a quick peek at our scheme here. So we've got the left atrium, okay, and up here we've got the right ventricle. So let's begin at the right ventricle. It's going to pump deoxygenated blood out through the pulmonary trunk, which branches into the left and right pulmonary arteries, then smaller arterioles, then smaller capillaries. Drop off CO2 in the lungs, pick up oxygen, then oxygenated blood comes into small little pulmonary venules on the right and the left, and larger pulmonary veins that dump into the left atrium, and then of course after it gets into the left ventricle, out to the body. Now you notice I said that after birth these pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins are the only ones, right? That's because before birth we have a special circulation of the fetus, and that's called fetal circulation. Now that only exists in the fetus, and it contains some special structures that allow that developing fetus to exchange materials with the mother. So this circulation differs before and after birth because the lungs are not functioning until after birth. The fetus obtains oxygen and nutrients from mom's blood and eliminates CO2 and other waste products into mom's blood. The exchange of materials between the fetal and maternal circulation occurs through the placenta. The placenta forms inside the uterus and attaches to the umbilicus of the fetus, or the navel of the fetus, by the umbilical cord. So the placenta communicates with the mother's cardiovascular system through a whole lot of small blood vessels that emerge from the uterine wall. The umbilical cord contains blood vessels that branch into capillaries in the placenta. Okay, so the placenta has blood vessels from baby and blood vessels from mom. Waste products from fetal blood diffuse out of the capillaries and into the spaces containing maternal blood in the placenta, and then finally into mom's veins in the uterus, and then into mom's circulation so she can get rid of those waste products. Nutrients travel in the opposite direction, from mom's blood vessels into the fetal capillaries through those vessels that are in the umbilical cord. Normally there's no direct mixing, though, of the maternal and fetal blood because all of the exchange occurs by diffusion through capillary walls in the placenta. So blood passes from the fetus to the placenta through two umbilical arteries that are in the umbilical cord. At the placenta, fetal blood picks up oxygen and nutrients and eliminates waste products. So the oxygenated blood returns from the placenta through a single umbilical vein that's in the umbilical cord. This vein goes to the liver of the fetus, but also to the ductus venosus, which drains directly into the inferior vena cava of the fetus. Most of that fetal blood doesn't pass from the right ventricle to the lungs like it does in our blood, right? So remember, the right ventricle in our circulation, the right ventricle contracts and we send all that deoxygenated blood out to the lungs for oxygenation to drop off that CO2. That doesn't happen that way in the fetus because the fetal lungs are non-functioning. So we do need to send a little bit of blood out there, though, for those developing tissues, but not for gas exchange. So there's an opening called the foramen ovale in the septum, the wall, between the right and the left atria. So most of the blood that enters the right atrium is going to pass through that foramen ovale into the left atrium and go right into systemic circulation. The blood that does pass through the right atrium into the right ventricle is going to be pumped into the pulmonary trunk. Most of that would go out to the lungs, right? Yeah, but not in the fetus. Very little of that blood is going to go out to those non-functioning lungs because there's a modification called the ductus arteriosus, which is a blood vessel that connects the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. So the blood in the aorta then is going to get most of that blood that's in the pulmonary trunk, and then it's carried out to all the fetal tissues through the systemic circulation. After birth, when the umbilical cord is tied off, blood no longer flows through those umbilical arteries, so they fill with connective tissue. And the distal portions of the umbilical arteries become fibrous cords. The arteries are closed, of course, right after birth when that umbilical cord is cut and clamped off, but the lumen of those blood vessels usually takes 2 to 3 months before it completely closes. The umbilical vein that's in the umbilical cord collapses but remains as the ligamentum teres, and that attaches the umbilicus to the liver. Remember, the umbilicus is your navel. The ductus venosus collapses but remains as the ligamentum venosum, which becomes a fibrous cord on the inferior surface of the liver. The placenta is expelled as the afterbirth, so it's gone. The foramen ovale usually closes shortly after birth and becomes a fibrous structure called the fossa ovalis, which is a depression that exists right there in the interatrial septum. So when the infant takes its first breath, the lungs expand and blood flow to the lungs increases. Blood returning from the lungs to the heart increases the pressure in the left atrium, and this forces closed that foramen ovale by pushing the valve that guards it against the inner atrial septum. Permanent closure, however, usually takes about a year. The ductus venosus, remember that was, or the ductus arteriosus, remember that was between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, closes by vasoconstriction almost immediately after birth and becomes a very tough fibrous structure called the ligamentum arteriosum. However, it also takes about 1 to 3 months for complete obliteration of the lumen or closure of that lumen. So if the foramen ovale or the ductus arteriosus fail to close, that is a condition known as patent, P-A-T-E-N-T. So you can have patent foramen ovale or patent ductus arteriosus. Now, this only becomes a major issue if they fail to close at all, and you have that mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, and of course that means that tissues of the infant are not being properly oxygenated. Most of the time, though, they do close on their own, but if it is severe, it can require surgery. Here you have a schematic diagram of fetal blood flow. So blood leaves the placenta into the umbilical vein. Some of it goes to the liver, most of it goes through the ductus venosus, directly to the vena cava, and then into the right atrium. Now, some of that blood, of course, is going to shoot through the opening, the hole, the foramen ovale, directly into the left atrium, the left ventricle, the aorta, and then out to systemic circulation, with some of it going back to the placenta through those umbilical arteries. But let's go back over here. We took that blood from the inferior vena cava into the right atrium. Some of it does go through the right ventricle and into the pulmonary trunk, with just a tiny little bit of that blood going out to the lungs through those pulmonary veins out to the lungs to nourish and take nutrients and oxygen out to those developing tissues, and then returns through pulmonary veins to the left atrium. Now, the pulmonary trunk, remember, had a modification between it and the aorta, and that little channel there was the ductus arteriosus. So most of the blood that enters the pulmonary trunk flows through the ductus arteriosus into the aorta and then into systemic circulation. As we see with almost everything we talk about, as you age, your body becomes less efficient. So with aging, cardiovascular changes include decreased compliance or distensibility of the aorta, reducing cardiac muscle fiber size, progressive loss of cardiac muscle strength, reduced cardiac output, decline in maximum heart rate, and an increase in blood pressure. Total blood cholesterol tends to increase as we increase LDL, the low density or lousy lipoproteins. HDLs, high density lipoproteins, or healthy cholesterol, tends to decrease. This leads to an increase in atherosclerosis and coronary artery disease. This is also a major cause of heart disease and death in older Americans. Congestive heart failure, which is a set of symptoms that's associated with impaired pumping of the heart, is also very prevalent in older individuals. Changes in blood vessels that serve the brain reduce nourishment to the brain and result in malfunction or death of brain cells. By age 80, cerebral blood flow is 20% less, and renal blood flow is 50% less than a person at that, or the same person would have at the age of 30, because of the effects of aging and the detriments of aging, the detrimental effects of aging on blood vessels. And then here in this last slide, I encourage you to look at how homeostasis and the cardiovascular system helps to maintain that homeostasis in different systems. For instance, just to look quickly, muscular system. Blood circulating through the exercising muscle removes heat and lactic acid. The urinary system. The heart and the blood vessels deliver blood to the kidneys where the blood is filtered. The kidneys affect the cardiovascular system by releasing renin, so we know about the aldosterone pathway there, right? The digestive system. Blood carries nutrients from the digestive system to the liver and out to body tissues. The skeletal system. The blood delivers calcium and phosphate that we have to build bone. But we also know that the skeletal system is important in the production of the blood cells. So I encourage you to look at each one of these and get an idea, again, of how all body systems are interrelated. And even though we're studying the cardiovascular system is directly tied to all body systems.